Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Children and Young People Select Committee. If we can do our usual thing of introducing ourselves for those who are watching on live streaming, I'd like, before we do that, just to welcome two of our cabinet members this morning. Phil Murphy, who's here to talk and answer questions about the developing budget proposals, and Richard John, who is our cabinet member for education. So welcome both, and welcome also to officers who will be presenting information to us as the morning goes on. So if we could do our introductions then. I'm Martin Grokert, I'm the County Councillor for Lansdowne Ward in Abergavenny, and I chair this committee.
Wendy Barnard, Democratic Services Officer.
Will McLean, Chief Officer, Children and Young People, Monmouthshire.
Phil Murphy, Cabinet Member for Resources.
Leanne Wakely, I'm the Chair of the Monmouthshire Association of School Governors.
Mike Fowler, Parent Governor Representative.
Maureen Powell, Councillor for Castle Ward, Abergavenny, and a member of this committee.
Jo Watkins, Councillor for Caldecott Castle Ward, member of this committee.
Good morning, Borodar. David Jones, I'm member for the Criconi Ward and a member of this committee.
Good morning, Borodar. Tudor Thomas, County Councillor for Priory Ward in Abergavenny, member of the committee.
Pete Strong, representing the National Education Union on the committee.
Richard John, County Councillor for Mitchell Troy Ward and Cabinet Member for Children and Young People.
Mark Howcroft, Assistant Head of Finance.
Louise Brown, Councillor for Shire Newton Ward and member of this committee.
Good morning, Sheila Woodhouse, Councillor for Grovefield Ward in Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
Good morning, Malcolm Lane, Councillor for the Mardy Ward and a member of this committee.
Good morning, Richard Roden, Councillor for Dixton with Osbaston in Monmouth, observing.
Good morning, Councillor Roger Harris, Cressonham Ward, Abergavenny and observing.
Good morning, Nikki Wellington, Finance Manager for Children and Young People.
And finally, Councillor Tony Easton, Dewstar Ward, Caldecott, observing today.
Thank you all very much and a very warm welcome. Moving on, item 2 is declarations of interest. I'm not sure if there will be any, but perhaps if people would just declare them when they feel it's necessary. Item 3 is the public forum. I see no members of the public here, so we can move on to the next item, which at this point was going to be a supplementary item, and we were going to get an update on the current state of play with the CENCOM service. Unfortunately, the head of service has emailed in just a few minutes ago to say he's unwell this morning and unable to come. But I would like to take that item now in probably a much abridged form, and then reissue the invitation to Roger, the head of service, to come to speak to our next committee meeting, if that's okay with you. I think it's only 3 or 4 weeks' time. But in the meantime, if I could ask Councillor Lane if he could turn his microphone off, and then Will McLean, the head of Children and Young Services, will give us as much information as he can at this point. But before he does that, if I could emphasise to any members who weren't here for the pre-meeting that there are issues here that may well be sub judice, and if I ask you not to mention something, if you could please stop at that point. So as far as we can this morning, Will tell us where we are as he understands it. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, committee. So, as the Chair said, it's a real pity that Roger can't be with us this morning. He's the leader of this service and has done so through this challenging period of time. And it would have been great to have his insight as to where we are. However, the 4 remaining partners, directors, we speak regularly about where we are in terms of the CENCOM developments. Clearly, it's an area that we're all very conscious of at the moment. The presentation that Roger had sent through to you, in essence, kind of sets out the range of services that the service provides, and they're on the communication intervention team, which is a support service for school-based staff, and then the 2 direct sets of interventions around hearing impairment and visually impaired services. There's also the service where those 2 need to come together, which is that area very complex, where children have both a hearing and a visual impairment, and how we think about supporting those children. So it's a really kind of positive service for us to have. It does allow us to provide services to very vulnerable young people at the highest level, and that's really important for us as an authority. If you see the presentation you've received, you can see there that we have 367 children being supported by CENCOM at the moment. The most significant group are hearing impaired in Monmouthshire, so 225 of that 367 are around hearing impairment. And that trend is quite interesting. When you look at that on the following slide, you'll see that visually impaired has stayed relatively stable over the last 3 years. The communication support has actually declined over that 3 years, particularly from 16-17 into 17-18. But the hearing impairment service has risen from 187 to 225. So that's clearly the area of support that we need most specifically. In terms of our contribution, Monmouthshire contributes 13.1% to the budget of CENCOM, just a shade under £300,000 last year. Next year, just a shade under £300,000. It's never been our intention or our expectation that we look to change that. We had a very I think, appropriate conversation with the service, because there was an allocation of underspends that the service had incurred because of the difficulty of recruiting teachers, which is one of the things which we'll talk about a little bit around the risks. But that's a figure that we're committed to and doesn't feature in our budget profiling at all. Just moving on, obviously the Newport withdrawal has been well discussed and debated within this chamber, so I'm not really going to comment any further on that position. The key part for us are around the risk factors, and I think just looking back to the presentation that we had in council from Ros, one of the mums of one of the children who works with CENCOM, you know, to hear her say that already there was an impact on the support for her child, I think does demonstrate that this decision is it's highly unlikely to come without any consequences for our service users. So I think Roger's very clearly set out the risks as he sees them. That change in staffing, you know, there is such dependence and reliance upon this expertise that actually change in that will be a risk for the families. The service itself having to lose expertise as they go into different areas and to work potentially is clearly a risk for us. And for the service themselves now, they're going to have to really look again at how that service is designed and how that service is operated in the future. They're going to have to think about prioritisation. There will be increased demand. And as I said, the hearing impairment has increased over the last 3 years. If that continues to do so, we know about the scarcity of those staff. So that will bring pressure. What we lose with Newport's decision is the resilience to flex our resource across the different authorities. So there clearly will be an impact, and that's a risk as we go forward. And finally, you know, in any time of change, there will always be an impact on the people who work in that service. And to think that any change goes without a consequence is a naive position in my expectation. And so clearly, you know, Roger is identifying in his presentation that there are concerns around staff morale and well-being. And that must be a concern because, again, staff morale, well-being, people taking time off because that's what they feel they need to do, and that's absolutely right, would then have an impact on the service that's delivered. And consequently, because of the removal of the service to the Newport element, there is less resilience to manage that. So we can see this kind of self-perpetuating set of circumstances. Having worked with Roger over the last year, he will be able to describe the situation, the service, far more eloquently and in depth than I will. But and I think if committee is minded to ask him back to the February meeting, I think that would be a valuable use of time. Thank you, Chair.
Bearing in mind that we can only really talk about Monmouthshire provision here, has anybody got any questions for Mr. McLean? Yes, Mike.
Just a couple of things, really. Just thinking about the knock-on of this and how well-versed we all are with Brexit at the moment, what is the mechanism to stop further partners withdrawing and further weakening the service? And when does the tipping point come that the service isn't fit? And then additionally, how do we square the new provision with the more demanding needs of the ALN bill that's working its way through at the moment?
Okay, in terms of the first one, in terms of stopping people leaving, this is a collaboration that's been in place since the abolition of Gwent, in that kind of that long-term kind of view. As I said, the four remaining partners are completely committed to it. Only last year, Caerphilly transferred a part of the service back into CENCOM, so I think that shows that level of commitment in the past. You can, and I suspect we will, look at strengthening collaborative governance arrangements. For instance, the arrangements we have in place around our collaboration and the EAS are set against a legal backing. I suspect as directors it's time now to look at all of our collaborative governance and look if there are things we can do around that in terms of timeliness of notice, in terms of contributions at the point of decision of withdrawal, and all of those types of things, which might make people just think through that decision. Now, clearly, there might well come a point in many organisations' perspective that they decide they want to change the shape of their service delivery, and that will be one which you hope is well informed and done with the children's best interests at heart, and that's the kind of the key driver. So there are governance things you can do. With regard to CENCOM, all I can say is, all of the discussions we've had is that the four authorities remain completely committed to the service. We also remain committed to the perspective that Roger has offered, that with some changes and so on, and a reprofiling, we will be able to offer a good service to our children and young people in the future. So that's the fundamental part for us. Absolutely right regarding the ALN bill. I'll be attending tomorrow a session with all directors and Welsh Government in Llandrindod to begin our consultation response to that legislation and the Code of Practice in particular. I think, there will be our high tariff, high need children whose needs we have to support in the new bill. I think there will be an increasing recognition of regional services. We've seen those certainly in terms of our work with Anira and Bevan and other partners in terms of mental health and emotional well-being, that when you have to think about, when you do think about more specialist, higher tier provision, you have to look at collaborating to do that right across the authorities in the former Gwent area. So yeah, that collaboration and the LN bill, I think, work hand in hand.
Any further questions? Yet, Louise.
Yes, just looking at the staffing table that we've got. I just wondered, is that a Gwent-wide table? And obviously, that would have. I'm not quite sure how this operates in relation to Monmouthshire as such. It's just really for the later point when we look at this again.
So the structure that's included in the presentation is Gwent-wide, so that's not specific to Monmouthshire. And because of the nature of the service, people will work across the various local authorities within the region to support those children. So, you know, we might have teachers working with our children some of the time, but then they'll go and work with children in Torvine or Newport. And that's the very nature of it, and having that highly specialised workforce. But I think Roger be in a much better place to answer that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, as I said, you know, we can only apologise, but it's unfortunate that having put so much effort into preparing his talk this morning, Richard is unable to do it personally. But I think it would be good to invite him back next month. Yeah, people nodding their heads. So let's do that. And thanks very much, Mr. McLean, for stepping in. I asked Mr. McLean if he would do that at about 8:25 this morning. So thank you very much indeed. Councillor Easton.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, because all the committee haven't asked a question. Are our Education Department in consultation discussion with the Newport City Council for their cabinet to look at reversing this decision and rejoining, or is there any future in that sort of approach?
We'll always try and work as close as we can with our partners. There is always work being undertaken across the 4 remaining partners. Clearly, because Torvine are the lead authority for this partnership, so Torvine are responsible for the employment and the pay and the management of the staff and the service. We work with Torvine to do that. So, but as I said, our response and our door, you know, we always want to see collaboration, because collaboration, from my particular perspective, is always a better solution, I think. So we would, you know, if that was a position that Newport were to arrive at, then that would be a position that we'd have to look at across the 4 of us.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're done on that one then, so thank you very much. Mr. Fowler, could you just turn your mic off? Thanks. If we can then go back to the formal agenda, the original agenda as it were, we're now on to item 4. And this is the start of our discussions around financial matters that will take up much of the rest of this meeting. So the first of these reports is about the capital strategy. Mr. Howcroft is making his way forward as I speak. So over to you, Mr. Howcroft. Thanks.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, apologies that this report is a little longer than the normal formulaic report that you receive. That's due to the fact that actually we have an additional requirement this year to actually consider a capital strategy that better aligns the capital resourcing of the council against various other strategies that members may have subscribed to, things like the asset management strategy, combining it with treasury, etc. So what we have to do for 2018-19, whilst we don't have to provide a full strategy, what we have to do is assess our preparedness to adopt a capital strategy against our admin procedures that we adopt. So the first part of this report is really probably explaining to you and teaching grandma to suck eggs in terms of what we do and which approvals get put where, and whether it actually satisfies the requirements of a capital strategy or will need to change. Just highlighting the changes by exception to you, we recognise that probably one of the weaknesses is around the prediction of pressures or needs that's included in Appendix 1. It tends to be very historic and outdated. And one of the ways that we're looking to actually address that is to better combine the work of the asset management group with the capital working groups, which are effectively flip sides of the same coin. So that where pressures are identified, a more immediate response is looked at in terms of how that can be afforded. So in terms of the detail for next year's capital strategy, the MTFP is based on a 4-year projection. The detail starts to be captured in section 6 of the report there and goes through the considerations of pressures and resources. And actually what we're proposing for this forthcoming year is largely a steady state approach to our capital programme. Insofar as we will finish off tranche A of the future schools agenda while considering our response and cost to tranche B and tranche C funding. But it'd be fair to say that actually at the moment that commitment financially is not in the capital programme because we haven't got cost certainty as to what those figures are. We have some flexibility around our capital receipts levels that you will see in the report that are likely to be built up over the next 4 years that will provide some flexibility. And obviously the consideration as to how we finance it, whether we adopt Welsh Government's MIM approach, which is effectively a revenue model, a bit like traditional PFI that members may recall, or alternatively that we progress the project ourselves as a capital programme item and actually derive part funding from Welsh Government to afford it that way. But that's still very much an open consideration at the moment and why we haven't actually pitched anything into the capital programme for next year. So in reflection that we regard that probably the identification of pressures is probably our biggest single weakness at the moment. One of the things that I am proposing for next year is that we reintroduce a survey budget up to £75,000, largely to look at condition survey of buildings and actually do a more cathartic assessment. The reason why I think it's sensible to reintroduce that is that members may recall that one of the conditions that full council has subscribed to is that for anything new to appear in the capital programme, it either needs to pay for itself, i.e. be self-financing, or it needs to replace something that's already in the capital programme as a higher priority. And you appreciate that probably for the first time I've provided an indication in the report there as to what I think are the relative priorities of different aspects of capital. That's included in paragraph 4.11. If I could just ask you to look at that because I'd be interested in some feedback from you as to whether you think that's reasonable or otherwise. So my pragmatism there is that in terms of our directing capital monies towards particular aspects, I think health and safety, legal and regulatory aspects are our number one priority, quickly followed by the use of capital to allow us to set a balanced budget and to deliver our corporate plan priorities. And then this is where there was some interest in one or two of the other selects in terms of the relative priority given to spend to save aspects or bringing money into the council. And I've already conceded with economy and development that attracting significant third-party or private match funding to the council probably needs to be more of a priority in use of our capital funding than it is in that table. So I've mentioned that we're going to actually add a survey budget of 75,000. The other new aspects in the capital programme are Seven View Replacement, which is a care home that sits within the boundaries, is coming to the end of its useful life. Members may understand that there's housing development placed on the Crick Road site, and there's provision on that site for employment land development, of which a care home replacement is the preferred choice. They're still working through their business case at the moment, which doesn't actually balance, but what we've done is we've allocated £300,000 worth of capital receipts to help facilitate that process and get a balanced business case. But colleagues in social care are still going through the quality surveyors process in terms of costing up the programme, etc. And once that's clear, I'll be reporting that back through to full council to get the gross costs included in there. The other aspect is around waste vehicles, which has gone to full council as a separate report. It's partly afforded by a pressure in the revenue budget and partly afforded by environment from the services in terms of leasing of those vehicles. And then the other refinement that I'm doing to the capital programme next year is splitting the property maintenance costs between works and staffing so that members get a better appreciation of the amount of on-cost that goes into works rather than simply direct works, because I think that may better inform how we go forward with our management of projects. Not included in the report, but you can appreciate that the capital budget and the revenue budget to a certain extent are an iterative process all the way through till February next year, We're still getting information from Welsh Government around capital grants, etc., which changes the position largely on a weekly basis. And probably it's useful to update members that actually we've been informed that we will get an extra £800,000 direct funding from Welsh Government to help with capital programmes next year. My earmark use for those is £200,000 in relation to replacement of 2 sewerage treatment plants that have failed or are failing during the year and that have necessitated tankering off supply to provide a more permanent solution. And I'm advocating to members that actually they look for the balance, i.e. about £600,000 into providing additional highway maintenance work. And on that score, I'm happy to take any queries that anyone's got on the capital budget proposals.
Okay, colleagues. A challenge there from Mr. Howcroft. Has he got 411 correct? But any other points or questions before we perhaps give a little specific thought to that? Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I was looking at basically the table that's to do with pressures, and you know, obviously mentions a number there. That's on Appendix 1. Presumably, these aren't actually budgeted figures. They're almost sort of, if you got all the money possible, that's what you'd aim for. And, you know, I just wondered if you could highlight the particular areas that are to do with schools, because obviously I'm looking at that on maintenance of schools and school traffic management improvements and so forth, and school fencing improvements, school kitchens and so forth. So I just wondered if there was more. I noticed on the Sevenview care home there's just a question mark there, but you know, I was sort of trying to concentrate on the children area in relation to the capital programme. And, you know, I mean, obviously, if you look at some of those figures like school fencing improvements, 68,000, well, is that going to be, what proportion of that will be spent and that sort of thing? You know, it's really sort of trying to equate it to this particular area of the committee's work, really.
Yeah, it would be fair to say that your assumption about, well, is that a liability or is that a wish list? It's more in respect of services coming back and saying, well, actually, we have a liability as a result of the assets that we got that we predict could be of the order of. But I think I actually described in my preamble, I'm not that confident about the level of forecasting on traditional works that actually I would expect to be more informed by direct survey work. I think when you reflect that the capital programme probably is of the order of £40 million annually, and the 2 largest items there are school replacement, that actually the infrastructure aspects around things like highways, maintenance, etc., DFG levels, etc., generally are kept at their historic levels to be able to afford some of those other initiatives. So there's probably things on that list of pressures that will probably never rise to the top of the pile to do, but they're useful for members and officers to have a reflection on, because occasionally and increasingly there are ad hoc pots of money that may very well allow for some of these things to be done under its specific terms and conditions. So having it on the radar and having members reflect upon what those liabilities are in setting the capital programme is probably useful. So, I mean, the single largest item on there is the £80 million highway maintenance scheme, which is why I'm proposing the majority of the extra money goes upon that. I think the number of queries that we've had in around potholes, insurance claims, etc., means that that's sensible. I'm also reflecting on the fact that actually probably the sewerage treatment aspect, tankering off twice a week is probably not a sustainable aspect, and probably needs to be reflected more explicitly in the programme. I was a bit disappointed when I looked at the pressures not to actually see sewerage treatment works as a separate category, but I'm understanding that it's actually included within property maintenance. But I still think that property maintenance could be further disaggregated to give members a better idea as to what the liability of the assets that we hold. So probably I would regard Appendix 1 as a bit of a work in progress and an evolving situation, if that's clear for you. In terms of the priorities for schools, well, the single biggest priority that the Council has set itself in relation to schools is its Tranche B considerations, which is the replacement of King Henry. Its ultimate objective is to have 4 secondary schools of a similar standard and quality. You won't be surprised to know that it costs of the order of about £40 million on the basis of Tranche A figures to replace a secondary school. The proposal for King Henry is a bit more involved than that in terms of having a campus-based approach from a 3 to 19. We haven't yet done the work to actually quantify what those costs are, but I suspect that probably the things like fencing improvements, unless afforded by specific grant, will take a secondary consideration to affording the Council's flagship priorities in the forthcoming years.
Mr McLean, if you'd like to follow that up, and then I'll call Miss Wakely then.
Thank you, Chair. Just to follow on what Mark has just said, clearly the Band B and the delivery of Band A are our kind of key considerations at the moment. But just to give members a reassurance around aspects such as traffic management around schools, the environment where our schools are built at the moment and the expectations around traffic flow will have changed significantly since their construction. So we're always working with our schools to understand those pressures. We've seen in another South Wales authority recently tragic events that was due to, in part, as far as I understand it, a significantly greater number of vehicles using school areas and some of the risks that proposes. So we're always kind of making sure that we are aware of those health and safety risks and working with our schools to make sure that those risks are mitigated effectively.
Miss Wakely.
Thank you. On the plans for secondary school replacement, originally when we first started talking about this way back 3 years ago, something like that, maybe longer, there was some talk about doing some work to the cluster primary schools to bring them to 21st century school education requirements. There's no mention of that in this. Has that now gone off the table completely, or is that still?
I can give you an overall perspective, and then perhaps Will, as the Director of CYP, can give you a more personal perspective on the education side of it. Whilst we chunk our projects up into 21st century schools, that's not to say that in the capital programme there isn't other aspects which actually help facilitate that. So you may recall that actually there's been a fairly widespread replacement of IT across the school portfolio in the last 18 months or so. One of the considerations in the south in terms of Welsh provision has been the introduction of an additional classroom build within the south of the county. So these considerations are actively being considered and are probably often overshadowed by the nice shiny secondary schools.
Councillor Murphy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a couple of things on that. You know that we're going through the new LDP process at the moment. So there's a lot of work going into looking at whether or not we need to make additional provision within primary schools in particular as a result of the additional housing that's going to come along. So there's a lot of assessment on that at the moment that Will may want to add to. The other point is that going back to that Appendix 1, the funding split has changed since that report was put forward. Welsh Government are now saying 65% that they'll put forward. So, it does make it a little bit easier. I won't say easier on its own. A little bit easier to afford, but if they'd like to change their mind and come up with a higher figure, then I won't stop them.
Any other comments or questions? From the chair, I'm very pleased to hear Mr. Howcroft say that hopefully we'll be able to address some pothole issues. I think most elected members will have had their ears burned many times on this issue at the moment. So it was good certainly to hear that. Councillor Thomas.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, looking at the property maintenance, and I know budgets are very sort of pressured and tight, but when it talks about, you know, health and safety and wind and weather, that, you know, that is a very low level of maintenance, and in one way, it's building up problems for us in the future in terms of the building stock, and B, I think sort of psychologically, if you're in a primary or a secondary school which isn't part of the 21st century schools programme, then it's quite galling that you may look at Caldicot or Monmouth Comp, brand spanking new, etc. And obviously King Henry will be in the future. But if you're in Chepstow or if you're in one of the other primary schools, then obviously it isn't. And if I were a parent of a child in school that isn't part of the 21st century schools programme, then I would feel a little bit short-changed, you know. And I appreciate budgets are incredibly tight, but that maintenance element isn't a great deal to keep the stock up to standard and for the children that are actually in school now.
No, I accept that point. Unfortunately, I have no panacea to resolve it. I mean, the annual programme maintenance budget is about 1.9 million. One of the reasons why I want to disaggregate property fees from works is just to actually understand better how much works is actually going on. I take your point that actually, whilst we're prioritising our future schools initiatives, then other services aren't getting the same extent of resourcing, and that's pretty true. I mean, you will appreciate that we try to act flexibly where possible, and you may appreciate that actually in the Monmouth situation, at the same time that we were doing a school, the Monmouth pool got a facelift and actually has a far better offer now than it had prior to that arrangement. We try to look where prudential borrowing from the service, extra income, etc. will afford borrowing. So we're thinking quite cathartically as to how we might address our responsibilities to our assets. But I think I've probably left you with the right reaction that at the moment our liabilities outstrip our resources.
I wonder if I could just ask Mr McLean, it will probably be from the chair. At County Council recently, we gave our consent for project teams to be appointed to take forward the new developments in Abergavenny. Has that team been appointed yet? Where exactly are with the build?
So with regards to the establishment of the team, there are some HR processes which are working through at the moment. I'd expect that team to be in place before half term. We had the first 21st Century Schools Board we've had for a little while at the early, I think it was Monday this week. It all do seem to blend into one at the moment. So yeah, Monday this week. We set about in that quite clearly our work streams that will be necessary to deliver Band B. But what we also did was to make sure that the 21st Century Schools Board will have oversight across the full range of school estate related matters. So we also took into account in that the ICT investments that have taken place. We talked about the developments that will be associated with the WESP and the drive to increase the number of Welsh speakers throughout Wales. And of course, as Councillor Murphy has already raised, the developments that will be required as and when housing development takes place in our authority. So there's a specific area looking at the Section 106 where there are specific areas of pressure to make sure that we maximise the value we can receive from developers where that's necessary, and to make sure that that money is spent in the most appropriate way to make sure that we meet the needs of our future learners. We've also begun to look at our longer term, by that I mean kind of into the next 10 to 15 years, and begun to think about what some of those pressures might be and what we might need to have to construct to enable all of our children to have access to kind of first-rate facilities. I think my overall perspective in terms of the schools is that for the most part, our schools are of an appropriate size and they are well placed. There are pressures. We know that, for instance, in the south of the county, in the Caldicot area, we know that there are pressures there. And we are looking at the moment to look at the quantum available to us and to find the most effective intervention that will address that. I think sometimes it's quite difficult. We can receive what looks like a significant sum of money in terms of a 106 for support of additional capacity in a school. An extra classroom doesn't actually help a school very much. They tend to work on 1.5, 2 form-entry models, and actually staging that, understanding where we've got the capacity to develop potentially another stream of entry. That's the way that we have to do that. So it's something which is very alive at the moment. The team is being progressed as we speak. Obviously, I'll bring that back and make an announcement to members when that team is put in place. But just to reassure members that actually, you know, that whole 106, that broader piece, is very much of our thoughts at the moment as we go forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's wind that one up there. And I think, in conclusion, it would be true to say that as a committee, we have been pleased to receive this report. And before it goes on to committee, we've raised few objections. Well, in fact, we've raised no objections to any of the plans and proposals in there. And so we're happy for it to move on to the next stage. If I could thank Mr. Howcroft for, as he says, a more detailed report than we've seen in the past. And we look forward to, from the pots of money that are going to be available, all the potholes in Monmouthshire disappearing over the next few weeks.
I think you've set me rather a chore there, Chair, but I will take your message back to Highways colleagues.
I think if we were in Mao Zedong's China, he probably would turn all the officers out of County Hall with a bucket of tar and a spade, and we'd all be out there. But maybe it's we won't go any further along that line. Let's move on from a look at our capital strategy to item number 5, which is the revenue budget proposals. I've already assured Councillor Murphy that as a committee, we do fully appreciate that we will only question him on issues that relate to children and young people. He has assured me that the usual seminar for members will be held this year, where we'll have a chance to raise issues pertaining to other committees and other issues. But for this morning, we are solely concerned with children and young people. So, Councillor Murphy, would you like to introduce us?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And yes, we are looking specifically at this report as set out. You're not going to get the full budget presentation. Most of you will see that several times at various other sessions. We just concentrate on the matters that actually relate to CYP. I'll go straight to item 3 on the report and look at the pressures. Between Mark and Nikki and Will, I'm sure they'll give you a lot of details on this, but we'll just run through and see where we are with this. You'll see in the pressures that the largest one there, 784,000, relates to the unfunded pension scheme. There's some pressures within the system where items that we were looking at in the past, measures that we thought we were going to be able to take to make savings, weren't coming to fruition. So as a result of that, we've had to accept them as further pressures into the system this year. We've also got some children-related items in social care and health, and the one there is particularly notable. And again, it's all to do with the fact that looking at the forecast outturns for the current year, it's quite evident that what we thought we were going to be able to achieve in previous years isn't achievable. So we brought it back in and accepted it as a pressure. There's no point in kidding ourselves that we can do things that quite clearly isn't working out. There are savings within the system that we are looking to help meet those pressures. And the Directorate has come up with pretty well all of the savings necessary to meet its pressures this year. And you'll see there's items there with regards to the revision of the provision at Mountain House, and I'm sure Will or Nicky will be saying a little bit more about that. And some items there with regards to the pay award, and particularly the teachers' pension scheme, although that seems to be changing from day to day. We still don't know quite what the support from Welsh Government is going to be. Westminster's given out money to English authorities to cope with that. So far, we're not quite sure where we are with regards to Welsh Government. So I think at that stage, Chair, because there's not that much in the way of amendments to the budget for children and young people, I'll leave it to members to raise questions. But the underlying thing with regards to schools, because we've got an eye obviously on the cumulative reserves in schools, and are conscious of the fact that it's the secondary schools that at the moment have got the largest deficits. We do have recovery plans that are actively being monitored there, but so that we don't put any further pressure on school balances, we are flatlining again, but accepting the additional pressures ourselves rather than passing them on to schools. There's one or two small items here that schools will have to manage, but in the grand scheme of things, it isn't very much really. But I'm sure, as I say, that Will and Nicky will have details on any questions that anybody wants to ask.
Thank you very much, Councillor Murphy, and you've certainly already stolen one of the things that I was going to ask you, which was about the school's budget. So thanks for clarifying that from the outset. Colleagues, who's going to kick off? Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I was looking at page 53, and obviously you've mentioned about the teachers' unfunded pension scheme, and there's obviously teachers' pay as well. My understanding is in England the Treasury has helped local government with these particular costs, and you've mentioned we've still to hear from Welsh Government. When are we likely to hear? Because obviously that's quite a significant amount there that's on page 53, which talks about 784,000. And the other question I've got on that same table on page 53 is, I noticed there was rates increases from the new schools. I just wondered whether there was any potential to appeal those rates increases. I presume they're based on value, and maybe that's not the case, but just wondered if that was something worth looking at as well. Thank you.
Could I, Mr. McLean kicks off, and then perhaps Mr. Howcroft, could you address that second point about the rates?
Thank you, Chair. So the teacher's pension is significant pressure for every local authority in Wales, obviously. The increase is that the employer's contribution went from 16% to 23%. That's the magnitude of the change. For us in Monmouthshire, it's about £112,000 a month additional that we need to find. It's a really, really significant sum of money. The Westminster Government have embarked on a consultation period in England where they are saying that they will meet that cost for a year. The reason they'll only meet that cost for a year is because there'll be a spending review in the intervening period, so then that will set the baselines for all government departments going forward, and they'll be able to be aware of that increased level of funding required for the pensions. We are in almost kind of daily contact now between the WLGA, the Association of Directors, with Welsh Government to understand their position. Funding of schools in England is slightly different, and the flow through to local authorities isn't of the same extent that it is in Wales, where it's 100% in Wales. In England, I think they're at over 50% now are academies and free schools, so it flows in a different way. Whether that has a consequence on any consequential money that may come to Wales, obviously the budget's been already set. If DFES are finding that money within their existing departmental funds, then there won't be a consequential for Wales. So all of these things are in play at the moment, but we are kind of working with all of our partners to make sure that Welsh Government in particular are very aware of the pressure that this will bring to bear. I think across Wales it's about £40 million, the pressure, for the next period. Okay, so that's what we're doing on that one, but it's absolutely fundamental. I think the important things for our school to be aware of is that at the moment, we are funding that increase to the schools. So we're holding the risk corporately. So the schools will receive the money for their pensions, for their teachers' pensions. The risk sits at the local authority level. And I think that's a really important message for our schools.
Yeah, before I get on to the NNDR, just the reason why the pay award doesn't appear there is because for the last, certainly this year and for next year, Welsh Government have already confirmed that they will afford that. So it's not treated as a net pressure, but as Will says, the unfunded pension aspect is a bit of an evolving piece this year. So in terms of the NNDR bills for Caldicot and Monmouth, it's simply symptomatic of the fact that when they've been revalued in terms of the footprint, the buildings, they're perceived as having a higher rateable value than the old buildings. We do have quite an active section that looks at appeals for our estates, and last year we actually managed to claw back £100,000 from that exercise. So certainly this will be one of our larger NNDR bills, and it will be on colleagues' radar to actually challenge that where possible. But I suspect that given the fact that it is such a recent valuation on it, there's probably going to be very little wriggle room. We equally find that actually from an insurance point of view, our costs have a tendency to go up when we have new assets, because the amount for fire insured is more than it ever was previously. But we've managed to absorb that this next year within the insurance portfolio without actually volunteering a cost to members to afford. So you'll appreciate that where we can manage the costs, we do so. Where we anticipate the costs so significant to be reported separately, that's what we try to do.
Okay, do you want to come back on that, Councillor Brown?
I'm just surprised, actually, that I know that charities and charitable shops and various other things, you know, have some exemptions or discounts, and I'm just very surprised that schools within business rates don't. I mean, it's just surprising that nobody's ever considered doing that, actually, because obviously I would have thought it was, you know, part and parcel of you know, promoting education and the need for education for all. Thank you.
At one level, I understand the point. I mean, what I would say is that the local authorities in Wales are simply a collection agency for Welsh Government in terms of the money that's collected from NNDR goes back into a central pot and is reallocated to teams. So there's no local discretion to that. It's a national policy, and I suspect that actually the reality is that were they to provide those sorts of concessions to all schools across Wales, in making up the shortfall, it would end up falling to the likes of businesses, etc., which are already describing a challenging period of affordability for them, shall we say.
Okay, who's going to ask the next question? In which case it'll be me. One of my anxieties is around the potential reduction in the specific learning difficulty service budget, with the money instead being divided between schools and the schools being trained around a more general literacy provision. My concern is really that under the Equality Act of 2010, specific learning difficulty, or dyslexia as it's often called, is clearly designated as a disability. And that in this chamber, having condemned one local authority for its provision around disability, I don't want to leave this authority open. So just a comment perhaps about why we're seeing that reduction in the specific learning disability service proposed.
Thank you, Chair. This relates to a specific service which has been in the past predicated on direct work with children. What we are proposing is that service is reshaped so that it acts more as an advisory service. We still retain 2 members of staff, one to work across the north, one to work across the south of the authority. They will work with schools to help schools fulfil their role in actually supporting those children. So it's working alongside the school to make sure that what's delivered in the classroom is appropriately differentiated and that those children can access the right level of learning and teaching that they need to. This is the model that we've seen developed across South Wales. We're probably the last authority to move away from having a significant teaching input into speech and language. And we think this is the steps that we will be able to take. That said, there is an ongoing discussion with the schools in terms of the response to the budget discussions. And I'm meeting schools a week today, and no doubt this will form a significant part of that discussions. Members will see that the schools currently contribute in excess of £60,000 to meet the costs. We haven't spoken to the schools about removing that money from them. So at the moment that remains back in the ISB. If the schools were minded to leave that money within the service, then we would look to change the model again into one whereby the schools were buying some additional support in if they felt that was necessary. So it's one which is a proposal, exactly as worded in the mandate itself, and it is a remodelling. So it's not a removal of a service, but it is a change in direction to support teachers as opposed to actually deliver. But recognise entirely the Chair's concerns, and it's one which, as I say, is open to dialogue at the moment with schools and other partners.
Councillor Watkins.
Thank you. So thankfully, I no longer have to declare an interest in this particular topic because my son is now at secondary and there's no proposed changes for secondary. But my son has experienced amazing support from the SPLD service over the last 3 years. And I also know other parents of children who have also received that support. By getting that specialist intervention, they have managed to progress enormously. The teachers come into the schools, they provide not just the one-on-one lessons with the children, which I do actually think is incredibly valuable, just half an hour of dedicated specialist support every week is very useful, but they also provide support for the class teachers to actually make sure the class teachers know what to do and the teaching assistants know what to do in order to actually then progress that. So what I'm very concerned about by removing any amount of that actual support is class teachers are already under a great deal of pressure. They already have many demands on their time. How are we sure that they're actually going to find the extra half an hour for an individual one-on-one with the child? They're not going to be a specialist. You've already said that they're not going to be specialists. They're just going to get extra training to support. How are we sure that these children are still going to get that level of intervention? I know some children who have gone from the stage of having to have the work with SPLD to going on to be able to work without that support. So they've gone on to secondary school without needing the extra support because they got the proper level of intervention early enough. So are we actually going still to make sure that these children get the support they need, and how are we going to monitor it as well? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Watkins. So in terms of the support, so it's exactly what we're saying. So support for teachers so that they are aware of the best strategies and approaches to support those learners will be unchanged. So that support, it remains there. And this is premised on the Welsh Government model. Okay, so that's the model that they expect to see, that we provide that support to enable teachers, to enable their whole class to access the appropriate learning that they should. If any children have got statements of need, which we will have at the moment until the new bill is fully introduced, then they will continue to receive all of that support. So anybody who receives, or anybody who has got a statement or as a SAPRA, School Action Plus with resource, will continue to receive all of that support. So this is about us making sure that the support for the teachers is there to make sure that they can deliver to the broader spectrum of children within their classrooms. I understand people's concerns about that one-to-one tuition time that might be lost under the new model. So that's why we're going to go back to the schools now again and talk about their continued investment and whether we can find a hybrid model, which is between what we have currently and what we're proposing now, and if there's a third way that we might be able to develop. So that's what that conversation is about.
Are there any further... Councillor Easton, you wanted to come in.
Yes, Chair, thank you. I was going to ask the same question that you've actually raised, but I'd like to expand on it. And I suppose I better declare an interest, as a personal interest. I'm a governor at Efin School and also a member of Morris Association of School Governors, so I think there's a connection there. This report doesn't really highlight the actual loss of the work other than full-time equivalents. The full-time equivalent basically drops 19 days' work every week off this particular service down to 8. 4 in the north, 4 in the south. So it doesn't say how many numbers of staff are involved. It means that the work is going to be thrown onto the teachers who are fully under pressure at the moment. And we're talking about what it would cost to individual schools. That, I think, is a matter for each school to consider. I won't make a comment on that. But I believe that we're reducing a service to be very hard to sustain with 4 shifts at the north and 4 shifts at the south, basically every week. It's an important service, and I believe that it should be reconsidered in the light of the comments that both you and Councillor Watkins has mentioned. But I'd like to ask a further question after you finish this topic, is regarding Ysgolly particularly. It is to do with schools, it's to do with transport. I'd like to come back on that afterwards.
Well, I'm sure that both our Cabinet Member for Finance and the Head of Service, CYP, will have noted the comments and will be taken into consideration as part of the budget development. So if you'd like to go on with your additional question.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's to do with Ysgolly particularly. It's to do with school transport. It's not within the CYP's remit, but it is a school matter. There's a pressure on transport for the next 3 years to Ysgol Gyffin Gwent Ysgoed and Pontypool's Ysgol Gyffin Gwent Llw, in as much as you've got to have 2 sets of transport. It will only affect Ysgol Efin, and I'm a governor in Efin, and of course this pressure really revolves around one school, although the school doesn't pay for it. It comes from the central budget. I'd like some reassurance that this pressure won't realise the fact that we cannot continue to provide that transport, yet I believe we've got a legal liability to do so. Am I correct?
If I could agree that it is proper to bring that question here, there are considerations of transport to Welsh medium schools. Councillor Thomas, I know that you're also a governor at a Welsh medium school. Are there issues at that school around costs of transport?
Thanks. Not that I'm aware of. I think it is probably a little bit clearer cut there in terms of Ysgol Gymraeg Gyfenni in Abergavenny. And obviously children who are in Welsh medium education, when they get to the secondary stage, they obviously transfer to Gwyn Llw. And there is no other choice in that sense. That is the secondary school that provides Welsh medium education for those children who wish to go ahead. So as far as I'm aware, I don't think it's affected. Obviously, as far as Ysgol Gyfyn East Coed and Ysgol Efin, then there is a different sort of situation there. So I can't really offer a great deal of help, I'm afraid, on that issue.
Okay, if Mr McLean could answer, and then there's the chance to follow up, Councillor Easton. Could you put your mic on?
There are 2 streams from Ysgol Efin, one to the new school in Newport, in Casnewydd, and the other one to Pontypool. When the children run out of time to go to the Pontypool one, there will only be 1 set of transport. For the next 3 years, there will be problems on pressures.
Okay, Mr McLean.
Okay, so just to be really clear, there is no charge for any child to be transported to Welsh medium school. That's our obligation under law, so we absolutely will continue to do that. I think what the budget pressure represents is the fact that Gwent Ysgoed has only been opened this year. So as we have more children who go through, Ysgol y Ffin, which is doing absolutely tremendous work at the moment, so as we have more children going from y Ffin to Gwent Ysgwyd, you will understandably, year on year, see a growth in the size of the cohort who need to be transported from Caldecott to Newport. So the pressure just recognises that there is a new route that has to be financed to take those children. And what might be suitable as a minibus in year 1, by year 5, will have to be a much bigger vehicle. So those are the pressures that we're recognising in that. I don't think it's anything more than that, Councillor.
Do you want to come back, or are you happy with
No,
that?
I just felt I needed to raise that as a governor, and the fact that it has been a little concern in the past whether the transport could be sustained. I know we've got to sustain it in some shape or form. Perhaps a cabinet member got a view on this.
Mr. Howcroft.
Yeah, I was just going to further reassure you, Councillor, having looked at the holistic spreadsheets, that the way that they're written up is to recognise that actually there's a pressure in the transport provision, but there's no corresponding need for a saving from within transport to afford that. So I wouldn't be expecting any pupils to be affected by that, or indeed any schools to be affected by that consequence. It's simply recognising that actually the costs for that service are likely to be more, and that members will need to actually consider that in the overall round when it comes to setting the budget.
I do know, thank you, I do know there's a thought that it might be passed on to the education portfolio as opposed to transport for the cost, but thank you very much, thank you.
Thank you for raising that. I have one further question, if members of the committee have nothing further, and it's a comment as much as a question. I think it's unfortunate that there is no representative from Children's Social Services here this morning, because obviously CYP is not just about education, it's about wider provision for children. And I don't know if any of our officers will be able to answer this, or maybe it could be sent forward to I guess Jane Rogers, who could reply. I'm anxious about increasing costs of fostering of young children within Monmouthshire. We are, I believe, getting a report about how Monmouthshire, there will be an increase in costs to Monmouthshire foster parents to bring us into line with the rest of South East Wales. There is then also the issue of the establishment of what we have called the therapeutic fostering service, of support to foster parents who agree to take on very challenging and difficult young people, some of whom are currently being educated out of county. And obviously, I think we would all agree in this committee that it is better to have these people local with their friends and in their community, but at the same time acknowledging that they will be very, very difficult in several ways. And that to support the foster parents looking after these youngsters, there will be additional costs in providing that support. And finally, there is the cost of still using agency staff in this area, despite assurances that I've heard since I became chair of this committee that the use of agency staff would cease. I hear adverts on local radio every day at the moment advertising for Monmouthshire foster parents. So I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that the authority is not trying to address this issue. It is, but there are clearly difficulties. And I just wonder if these things added together will create an additional pressure on the budget. But as I say, if officers here can't answer that this morning, or the cabinet member, perhaps I could ask that we as a committee get a written response. But where are we at, Mr. McLean? Sorry, Mr. Howcroft.
Yeah, I share your concern, Chair. I mean, there is really no substitute for a senior officer of social care to come here and explain the proposals and reassure you. What I would like to do, though, if anyone's got any specific proposals, if they're fed back through the chair, I will endeavour to get a response back through yourself in a written fashion that clarifies matters. I'm probably not close enough to the service to talk about the specific disability fostering side of it, but what I can do is probably explain or reassure you about the Gwent basis. What we've appreciated over the last couple of years is that where we're located as a council, with the Welsh border, etc., and with the bridge tolls, we struggle to get sufficient fostering parents to assist us with the provision of the fostering service. In looking at it on more of a Gwent footprint and having a rate that reflects a Gwent-wide level to foster carers, there is a pressure for us likely to anticipate in terms of our costs as a council will go up from that. But the consequence from that is that you will have a bigger pool of foster carers to draw upon across the county. So actually the reality is that the service to the individuals may get better. Whilst initially we anticipate a cost going up in terms of the amount paid to foster carers to support an all Gwent basis, the reality is at the moment some of our costs can be quite volatile in terms of actually using fostering agencies, etc., rather than actually individuals. So probably the activity data will indicate what the net benefit or otherwise is. I'm confident that actually moving to a Gwent-wide provision is more sustainable for the individual affected. What we've tried to do in this budget process is recognise that up front there will probably be some additional costs for the council to bear. When I look to the savings from social care, there's no indication that actually that service or those increased costs will be borne within the social care environment. They're ones that will be spread holistically across the council in setting its overall budget. But I would like to take your queries back around individual cases or outside of county placement that I can see that I'm not close enough to give you an informed view on. I'm sorry.
Okay, I appreciate that. Councillor Thomas.
I'm Vice Chair of Looked After Children. Obviously, I can't answer some of those detailed questions, but personally, on my experience on that committee, I welcome this move to the Gwent-wide sort of rate of pay and remuneration, because in reality, people are going to go for employment or go as foster carers, parents, to an authority that obviously pays possibly a higher rate. And I think that's been one of the major difficulties for foster care recruitment of foster carers in Monmouthshire as an authority. And obviously we sit much closer to the English border than does, say, Caerphilly or even Newport. And I think that is a major issue. So personally, I welcome that. That should improve things. There has been a huge drive to recruit foster carers, but inevitably in that sort of specialist work, there is a dropout figure, and a figure that comes to mind is from one event that I attended, 27 people came forward as foster carers, but by the end of the process that had been shaved down to 3, because obviously many of those people were not suitable for that sort of role. And at the end of the day, it reminds me of sort of a school situation. When you bring in cover teachers, it costs more per sort of hour, etc., than it does to retain your own staff. And certainly for foster carers, we're sending children out of county at great cost. My own feeling is I would want to see children being cared for within their own community and certainly within the authority, and not being sent across the border or elsewhere. So I do think it's a big issue, but I think an extra budget now will, in the long term, reap benefits. That would be my feeling.
Mr. McLean.
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up on the second pressure there that's in there, which will be impacting on 21-22, which is in this paper known as Project 5. That was one of the projects that's been developed on a regional basis, working with Aneurin and Bevan and other local authority partners. It's now known as MIST, so that's probably a term which you'll come to hear in the future. And MIST is my support team. This is the very intensive fostering support for children who are currently in settings outside of the authority. The reason that the pressure becomes apparent in 21-22 is that will be grant funded for the next 2 years. To establish it, we're working with Blaenau Gwent as our partner in that particular project. I believe they're at the position now of recruiting members of staff to start that work. So I think that's really positive. It's been supported by the Intermediate care fund from Welsh Government, part of the transformation piece, which is being led across Nair and Bevan. So I think that's one which will actually give us more stability in terms of our service provision, but also be more cost effective in the future.
Thank you very much indeed. Any final points from committee? If I could just sum up then, and thank officers and indeed our Cabinet member for coming along this morning, answering our questions. I wonder if the recommendation would clearly be that we accept this and send the report forward as part of the budget proposals. But I would also... yes, Councillor Brown.
My understanding is that basically we've done the capital, we've done the revenue, and then there's a separate report on the budget proposals itself. Am I correct or not?
Mr Howcroft?
No, you've looked at the capital budget proposals. This last report was the revenue budget proposals, and now you're going to move into the current year's monitoring report. The question is whether you feel that you've had a sufficient opportunity to actually discuss the social care aspects, or whether in your recommendation you want to put a proviso to submit questions or concerns through the chair.
Yeah, that certainly is. Yeah, okay, Councillor Brown, quickly.
Yeah, I think in terms of Appendix 1, Summary of Budget Pressures, I think it actually mentions about, can't find the page now, but there is, oh yes, sorry, it's Appendix 2, and it's on page 77, and it talks about the situation with regard to the additional learning review, and also including Mountain House. It's CYP 006 in that table, and it mentions a budget proposal. Now, I don't know anything about Mountain House is in my ward, and I don't know about anything about this budget proposal. And has there been a consultation with Mountain House as well? So could you, because obviously there's a saving there that's mentioned on continuation of inclusion review, including Mountain House. I know there's supposed to be a report coming later on that, but we don't know what the report is or what it will say, and you know, perhaps we could have a little bit more information on that, as it's a specific budget proposal. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly that would be covered under agenda item 5, I think. So I'm glad you managed to raise that before I moved on. I do note that the current situation at Mountain House is that there is only one student in residence, whereas at one time it was a source of revenue from other local authorities into Monmouthshire. So any comments on that, Mr McLean?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Chair. So that saving with regards to Mountain House is, members may be aware that every year a school's funding is determined by the number of children who are in the school. So schools, and I know we have governors here, will experience fluctuations in their level of funding on two factors. One being the number of children in school, the second being the value of the average weighted pupil unit funding that goes in. So those are the two multipliers. Over an extended period of time, Mountain House has been funded as though the school is full, as opposed to the number of children in the school. Given the pressures that exist within the financial CYP envelope this year, and trying to arrive at a balanced budget, we've taken the decision to move to a position whereby, I guess in an equitable sense, we're going to fund the school not on the exact number of children who are in school, but at a number closer to the number of children who are in school. So recognising the challenging children who are in school, we're just adjusting down that one of those multipliers to do that. The value is £275,000. And that is part of the consultation process that we're undertaking, and we're talking to the school about it and other parties around that reduction. Okay.
Is there any further question you'd like to come back with, Councillor
Well,
Brown?
hopefully we'll get a bit more information on the practicalities of it when it's reported to this committee, presumably, because I think it's in the forward programme, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess there are two parts to that. So this particular proposal is around the the kind of the annual budget setting process that sits as part of, but not directly, the inclusion review, which exactly as you say, we are due to bring back additional information to this committee in the future.
Okay, I'll give you one more intervention, and then Councillor Watkins is looking to me.
Yes, I mean, obviously, we're dealing with children who've got social, emotional and behavioural needs. And I know recently that there was a small fire in a kitchen area in that particular thing. So obviously, you know, in terms of health and safety, we need to ensure that there's sufficient staff supervision. And I think I would like to add that point. Thank you.
I can assure Councillor Brown that there is absolutely adequate staff cover at Mountain House. I think all we're doing is redressing the fact that currently we're funding a school to have, I think it's nigh on 50 children in situ, and the school is running nearer 25 children in situ. So there is an inequitability, which I have failed to say, between how we treat our mainstream schools and how we're treating Mountain House. So we're simply redressing that point at the moment.
I'd like to move on from that now because I think we're beginning to stray into future work programmes rather than this year's budget. But Councillor Watkins.
This is then just as a very quick point of clarity. I believed that the Mountain House question was only going to end up going back to the Cabinet. I didn't actually know it was coming back to CYP. It would be very nice if it was coming back to CYP. But could you provide just some clarity as to where that review is actually going to end up sitting, since we have both Cabinet members here?
Okay, very quickly an answer, and then I'm going to move on.
We would bring the paper to CYP in the first instance, and then it will go to Cabinet for proper decision.
Okay, so we've got recommendations to approve. I would like to add to them that in the absence of a senior officer from social care that requests about questioning about additional possible budget pressures around the costs of fostering are sent to us as a written answer that I can then circulate to members of the committee. And I think further we would ask that individual points that have been raised are specifically addressed when this issue both goes forward to the all-member seminar and, of course, more importantly, perhaps finally to Cabinet. Are we happy to accept those recommendations with those slight additional caveats? Thank you. Everybody's nodding, so I take that as approval. So we've looked at capital, we've looked at revenue for next year. The next item is item number 6 on our agenda, which is where we are doing with this year's money. So month 7, revenue and capital monitoring. Ms. Wellington, are you going to lead us on this one? Right, Mr. Howcroft, you're earning your money this morning before committee.
Always do, Chair.
If I'd like to thank Councillor Murphy for coming to listen to the comments of committee, and we do appreciate that, and thank you very much for your time. So we'll kick off the month 7 monitoring. Mr. Howcroft to kick off.
Yes, you must be getting sick of hearing my voice. I've tried something different with this report. I've actually tried to colour code the bits that relate to your portfolio on one of the other select suggestions. I appreciate that it must be quite difficult for the chair to manage some of the
If I could just interject and say it made a huge difference, and it is in our pre-meeting comment was made how much easier it was to actually isolate the bits that are specifically to do with us. So many thanks before we go any further.
Super. You'll appreciate that from my perspective, what I'm trying to do is twofold. As members of the authority, you're expected to have a general understanding of the financial position of the council. So the report is partly to brief you on that concern, but then also to highlight those bits that are related specifically to this portfolio that attract your interest. The problem in not sufficiently signposting it with colours in the past is that members tended to jump around the agenda and ask things of personal interest to them or whatever. So I'm hoping that it will be of use to you. So the purpose of this report is largely for selects to consider as part of their responsibility whether Cabinet's role in terms of providing effective budget monitoring is being met, to monitor the extent of which budgets are spent in accordance with the agreed budget that you've decided upon, challenge the reasonableness of any projected overspends or underspends, and monitor the efficiency savings that we come to you annually as part of the budget process to get your view upon and agree. So it's quite important to us that the monitoring report covers off savings progress through the year. The overall position was a £316,000 surplus at month 7, which is a beneficial position on month 2, but I would stress to you that actually that position is a surplus largely because we've chosen to utilise part of this year's capital money from Welsh Government to actually capitalise some revenue expenses, which otherwise, if we didn't do, would have put us into about £150,000 loss. So in terms of the delivery of the savings, we've achieved 86% of the target set, and obviously the report goes into details as to which ones aren't being met, and I'm recalling that actually the ones for this area have been met in full. If we turn to paragraph... Oops. There we are, right. If we turn to paragraph 3.2.4, that relates to the specific commentary in relation to Children and Young People's Directorate and the Children's Services aspect of social care. I will try to undertake any questions or queries that we've got in relation to their monitoring, but obviously if they're of a detailed nature, I may very well need to take them back to officers. But I suspect at this point I'll probably hand over to Nikki to go through the CYP aspects for you.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Chair. So we're looking at CYP on page 684. The Directorate as a whole was overspent by 329,000, which is actually an improvement of about 52,000 on month 7. The main overspends, a lot of you members will be familiar with. Mountain House, we saw a shortfall in income of about 337,000. I say Mountain House, actually that was, the majority of it was for Mountain House, but some of it will be received from direct into the authority for children placed in our mainstream schools. Outer county placements was overspent by, outer county placements and independents were overspent by 74,000. That's the net of the two figures. Again, reported as last time, there's some post-16 pupils that have stayed on in school, which we were anticipating to leave, but obviously they have additional costs for us. School Action, which is the support that we put into schools to support children remaining in our mainstream. So that fund was overspent by 93,000. In addition to that, there was a small overspend on breakfast clubs of 45,000. 25 of that is relating to additional staffing within those clubs, which we're working closely with schools to bring back in line, and 20,000 of that was a shortfall on the income that we were anticipating at this point in time. Offsetting those overspends, the underspends, there was 92,000 for the ISB, the individual schools budget. Primarily, that was an award that was provided to us by Welsh Government to fund a pay award for teachers. All of the schools have had their full increase, but you will be aware that we afforded some of that within the medium-term financial plan anyway. So we have given the schools where they have seen additional costs, they will all have the additional income to offset those costs. So the pay award will be fully funded for schools this year. There's a 40,000 saving on early years. That was a grant that was received for a post that was already in place in relation to the childcare offer. 30,000 underspend on the foundation phase training, again relating to a reduction in pupil numbers around there, so we managed to make the saving there. And then within management and finance, there's been a couple of vacancies that have been held over, so they were near enough 70,000 in terms of savings that were made across those two cost centres. In terms of the savings, Mark has mentioned them earlier. There was a slight shortfall in our savings, 35,000. 20 of that is being delayed and put into next year relating to breakfast clubs, and 15,000 we made an assumption around the retirement budget that we pay out for teachers that have previously retired. Unfortunately, the settlement figure that we're receiving in is slightly higher than we were anticipating by 15,000, so we won't be able to make that saving. If I move on to schools now, so schools, we started off with a surplus balance of schools of 175,000, anticipating this year that we will use 833,000 of that, which will obviously see us in a collective deficit of 658,000. I mentioned before, when you look at the appendix, I mentioned before the pay award that is going out to schools. At the point of time that we received, the reports were published, we didn't know the individual schools, so there are lines in there that says the pay award, but that will be attributed to individual schools. So although the bottom line is right, you'll see fluctuations in school, individual school balances as we move forward. 17 schools in deficit, and as I said, all the details on the school balances were shown in Appendix 2. Finally, the only other area I want to cover is the capital. Mark has spoken previously about the two substantial builds that we've got in Monmouth and Caldecott. Currently, we're reporting 1.1 million over. The split is shown in there, so 700,000 on Caldecott and 350,000 on Monmouth, primarily relating to management costs and, well, no, primarily relating to removal of asbestos, which wasn't anticipated at the time that the contracts were let, and obviously some prolongation in terms of the management costs there. And the only other capital spend we've got is 206,000, which relates to over mono, and that's for the SNRB, increasing the capacity there in our primary school. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Howcroft.
Yeah, just before you receive any questions, I mean, just on the social care aspect, children's social care has very little capital provision to the extent that it's negligible. On the children's services, they are incurring over £500,000 overspend. It's probably one of the more challenging areas of the budget to manage, given the volatility. One case decision could end up with £100,000 costs for a year. That's the extent of volatility. Last year, collectively, they were 1.6 million adrift. Some of that has come in through savings within the services, but you may recall that every year, actually, the council largely provides children's services with some money in the form of accommodating its pressures, and next year is no different. So at the moment, 500,000 is a substantially better position than the equivalent last year. We would expect it to be given the resources that are put into it, but probably the most pleasing aspect is that actually the pressure within children's social care is actually absorbed within the social care environment, and that is not usual. So I know that it's odd for an accountant to say that the budget is a very artificial construct, but it's nice to see that actually within the directorate they are providing holistic services, and that one's savings are compensating for the other's pressures. And on that point, happy to take any questions.
Thanks. I think that as a select committee, part of our role is to have a look at where we are now and where we were last year, and to see if services are still being provided as effectively and so on. And to look at where there are new potential budget pressures and so on. And members may remember that Ms. Rogers from Social Care was talking to us at I think it was our last meeting, about the spike in the number of looked after children in Monmouthshire, and the increase in the numbers on the Child Protection Register. And these things can't be planned for in advance. So it's good to hear the reassurances from Mr. Howcroft that the authority is aware of these wider pressures and does its best to address them when they do arise. But I think so far this morning we've been looking forward into the budget for next year. We're now looking at where we are with the budget that we've got for this year. And as the monitoring progresses as the year goes on, we get a clearer picture of whether we're going to have enough funding in there to deliver. So, Councillor Brown, you wish to come in.
Yes, thank you. It was mentioned about, I'll just read the relevant paragraph in the report. It says, despite increasing the recruitment level, i.e. charging level for students from outside of Monmouthshire, in last year's budget, Cycle Mountain House brings a recruitment pressure of 336,000. This will be addressed for the last term of the year by looking to increase the recruitment levels in year. The future of Mountain House is a key focus of the additional learning needs review. I've got two questions arising from that. When is it likely that the additional learning needs review will be undertaken and completed or consulted on? And secondly, the question is, were these outside authorities not paying what they should have, and is there some sort of shortfall there? Because I don't really understand that paragraph, and perhaps you could explain to me. Thank you.
I'll answer the first part, and I suspect Nicky will pick up the second. He said hopefully. So with regards to the ALN review, we're in the final stages of that, and that's what we will bring back in February to this committee. It will then kind of crystallise and allow us to implement our final design in terms of how we support our vulnerable learners. It's a combination with regards to the recruitment in terms of the amount that we charge, and we've got to find a point whereby it's still a provision which is attractive to other authorities to place into, and that's an important thing. So you can't, there are competitors in the relatively near distance in terms of places in Penarth and so on, and in Monmouthshire itself. There are independent schools in Monmouthshire who provide similar services for the same cohort of children. But the other part is in terms of the reducing number of children who are there. But I'll pass on to Nicky now, we'll have the details.
Yeah, so in terms of the recruitment income that we receive from other authorities, I think we've spoken in the previous agenda item around the reducing numbers of children that are accessing Mountain House and the reduction in the numbers there. Mountain House costs, as we said before, are out with the, go out once a year in terms of the funding for the school. There are some costs that they can flex around that as the reducing numbers as the pupil numbers reduce, and there are some that are fixed. Obviously, you have to stick to teaching ratios, and you have to pay your premises costs. So there is a lot of fixed costs within the school. What we have seen is the number of pupils reducing. So obviously, the costs are staying relatively similar, and the numbers are reducing. So the cost per pupil is going up, and the cost per pupil that we would need to charge to other authorities will therefore rise. However, as Will has already seen, we need to be mindful that we don't place excessive costs to other authorities and they do not buy that service, because there are competitors out there. So it's a very fine balancing act that we need to consider. We do regularly review it, so we do know where we sit within there. And over the years, we do try and recover everything that we pay out.
So Chairman, question of sending out a bill to another authority and them not paying then? No. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for raising that and the reassurance we've been given. Next question, Mr. Fowler.
There's a suggestion in the report about the yo-yoing at Chepstow, looking at its budget. So it's when I then go to compare the four comprehensives, and there's kind of concerns just looking at the four of them collectively. It's great to see that King Henry has turned a small surplus within year, so they've nibbled away at theirs. Similarly at Caldecott, they've got a small, but by the figures of the budget of a comprehensive, those figures are small, effectively. Then Monmouth has continued to increase its deficit, and then Chepstow's the one where we've seen this huge swing, and having been the one comprehensive that had the big surplus, they've pretty much spent their entire surplus, and it is the yo-yoing that you suggest. I was just trying to understand more why that yo-yo's occurred, that with the support that they've had over the last few years, have got themselves into a surplus and a healthy position, to have suddenly lost that all within 1 year is a reasonable concern.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, for that. In terms of Chepstow School, you are right. They brought forward a surplus of 158,000, planning to spend about 156. There are a number of staffing changes that are happening at the school at the moment. There is a new head that is due to start just after Easter. The school, to be fair, have faced quite inflated costs around the transition period. From September, they've had interim heads in, and now they've got an acting head in now for this term. So while we talk about yo-yoing effect, I would say that the costs within Chepstow are well controlled, although they have seen an increase in costs because of certain things that have happened in the school. We know about those costs, where I think it's fair to say in the past perhaps we didn't know the full picture of those costs. I think the difference this time is that we know about those costs and therefore can help the school prepare for anything that happens in the future.
Okay, any other comments? Mr. Howcroft.
Yeah, could I just helpfully draw a linkage between this report and the one that you saw on the capital proposals? So if you look at paragraph 3.65, that talks about the extra money that we've had in within year from Welsh Government to allocate to capital schemes, 1.3 million. Mr. Wakely this morning said, well, appreciating that your priorities are secondary school replacement, are we making sure that we're actually not ignoring the rest of the built environment for schools? You can actually see in that list that actually 150 of the 600,000 has been allocated specifically to children and young people initiatives, be it reception improvements, additional classrooms or IT aspects. And actually after accommodating some pressures within other departments, more notably enterprise, the rump of that balance is to be used in affording our tranche A commitments for the two secondary schools. So that should give you a reassurance and a confidence.
Okay, before we wrap up, just a sort of general question from me, I think, really. As I alluded to, I think that this periodic monitoring of how the budget is going gives us a picture that evolves as the year goes on. Have there been any hiccups along the way or any unexpected pressures that have come during the course of the year? Or how do you feel the year is going so far in terms of ending the financial year where we would hope to be? I don't mind who asks.
I'll give you a general perspective if Will gives you a local perspective to CYP. From a general perspective, you can appreciate that we've got perhaps 200 plus budget holders who manage a budget. I'm always reassured when I can actually provide a forecast which errs on the surplus side rather than a deficit. And you are right, it does evolve through the year, such that service managers are quite at the start of the year when we had a focus from them. They obviously appreciate that they've got to make certain savings in certain areas, but might not necessarily have progressed so far to have a confidence about some of those savings. So they're usually quite prudent in their figures, and they generally get better through the year as we go on. The areas of volatility this year, children's services, as we spoke about, remains a pressure. I think members focused on school balances is important from the perspective of how it affects the council fund and your financial planning assumptions. To set reserve levels between 4 and 6% of net expenditure is important to you. Probably the most things that cause me a degree of angst and hair loss, and I haven't got a lot less to lose, is things like the unknowns through the year. So things like the alternate delivery model for the council. We like certainty in accounts. Obviously, it's quite right that we go through a process of understanding what that service might look like if it were outsourced. But I'll breathe a bit happier when I understand that it's actually affordable in terms of the plans and the aspirations. Similarly, we're looking to, at the end of this year, no longer provide the management support for SRS. So that will revert to Torvine. So there's a number of things that we do behind the scenes that members don't necessarily see from a budget consideration. But I think probably a council's single biggest resource remains its staffing. And actually there are additional demands on our times that means that actually the juggling of providing a robust forecast to you as well as entertaining some of these other necessary activities is becoming a challenge, or becoming more of a challenge, shall I say. But I don't think that's specific just to finance. There are generally less and less of us every year, and actually there's an evolving regulatory arrangement and requirements upon all services to manage those. So I'm not bemoaning the fact, but from my perspective, having a little bit more time on the forecasting, having a bit ability to delve into some of those figures and perhaps act as a business partner to resolve some of the things before it gets presented to members would be my wish.
Anything to add, Mr. McLean, or are you just happy with that?
I think the point is really important that actually through the year, what we want to ensure is that the money that we do put in, and I'm acutely aware when we begin these kind of budget rounds and so on, that education is a really significant element of the authority's budget. So for me, it's always about that balance between, what we continue to invest in our schools, our teachers, and our services for children and young people, and ensuring that the outcomes that we're getting and the standards that we're achieving in our schools is at an appropriate level. So that's the balance that we're always looking. And I suspect, hopefully at some point in the relatively near future, that my Chief Officer's report will come to this committee. And that's the point, I guess, in which we gauge, the process of that evaluation of the year in a financial terms and in terms of the outcomes that we've achieved. I think in terms of how the year progresses, I think, Band B, or Band A rather, at the moment, in terms of things like the risks around the asbestos and those unknowns, does give us all cause for concern. So we know what we've found in Caldecott now, and the demolition is complete. What we find in Monmouth will be one of those things which we have to wait and see what those buildings are like. We know they're of a similar age. We know that the asbestos is a risk there, so that continues to be something for us to be aware of. And as ever, throughout any year, and as any complex organisation as big as CYP and the associated schools are, there are staffing pressures and costs which we see which are unavoidable. And we know that the pressures on school to manage their supply costs, when people do take decisions to move on and so on, it's difficult in that whole thing. So I think some of the volatility around staff and some of those unknowns as they emerge around not only asbestos, but also in terms of, the really vulnerable learners we have, and exactly the point Mark made around the pressures around social services. We have children move into county frequently who bring, significant educational need, with expectations of continuation of support and so on. So those remain challenges for us all. So, yeah.
Yeah, one final point.
One thing I probably should have said is that you'll appreciate that month 2 was a £380,000 forecast deficit, and that month 7 is a £300,000 surplus. The reality is that both of those figures are less than 0.5% variation against the overall budget for the year, which, if I use an anecdote, it's a bit like you giving your cash cards and your checkbooks to your neighbours for the year and expecting them to come in with the same figures that you incurred last year on your bank statement. It is quite challenging. As I said, 200 plus budget holders. Takes time to get around them. The nuances of their services, they're all different in the way that they cope with things and different pressures that they manage. I think it's a sterling job by the services and the directors to actually get that close. And whilst I hope to be in a surplus position at the end of the year, if I'm within 0.5% of the overall budget, I would be quite happy. But obviously, with my accountancy background, I'd hope to be in a surplus to be able to replenish 1 or 2 of the reserve positions that I've reported you this morning.
I think that's a position we'd all hold, Mr. Howcroft. Thank you for that. Before I ask approval for the recommendations, just one technical point on 2.2, if I may. It refers there to capitalising £444,000 expenditure. Decision needs to be considered by full council in January. I don't recollect that coming to full council, and there are no more full councils this month. Was it just that when the report was written, you weren't aware of when it would be going forward?
There is the timing issue that when this was drafted, that was the intention. I think the agenda for that meeting has been overtaken by other things. I understand that there's a special advocated for February, and I've already drafted the report accordingly. It's really a process matter that actually the Constitution regards the agreement of the capital programme to rest with full council rather than cabinet or individual committees.
Okay, thanks for just clarifying that point. So we've got the recommendations there. As I said in my opening remarks for this agenda item, part of our role as a scrutiny committee is to compare performance and just check that people aren't going off the boil, that we keep an eye on the ball, and that our officers are doing their best to monitor budgets so they can operate within the confines of the money they've got. I think we've got a clear picture of our directorate doing that very successfully. Are you happy that we send this forward for its next step in consideration without any amendments? Okay, there we are. Yeah, it's happy for that to go forward. Everybody's nodding, so rather than... Well, nem com, as they say in some places, without comment. So thank you very much for that. Moving on then to item 7, which is the confirmation of the minutes. And you must forgive me at this point, I'm still used to minutes coming right at the start. And I think at the start of the meeting, I forgot to ask for any apologies for absence. And I know that my vice chair has emailed in this morning to say she's not well. And so certainly I'd like to give the apologies for Councillor Jones. Any other apologies?
No, only from some of the other councillors not on this committee who were planning to come to the CENCOM part, which was Councillors Pratt, Pavia and Penny Jones.
Well, sometimes their absence is fortuitous, as that didn't go ahead anyways. My apologies, committee, for that. So then we get to the confirmation of the minutes. I don't intend to go through them in any detail. You've had them for a week or so. Matters arising, Mr. Fowler?
Can I just... the minutes don't suggest that I was there, and I was there. Just a small amendment.
Indeed, I remember it well. I can vouch for your presence. Are there any other issues arising from them? I've just got a couple of things, and I mentioned it at the special meeting that we had very early in January, but quite a few people weren't able to get to that. And it's worth recording, I think, that you'll remember at our last full meeting we had the presentation from the Abergavenny schools and the Ethnic Minority Support Service about provision for the Syrian refugee children. And committee asked that I write to Kirsty Williams as the responsible Minister for Education to commend the service that the children received. I did that and had a signed response back from Kirsty Williams saying that she was aware of the excellence of the provision and thanking us for bringing that further to her attention. I also was asked to write about additional time in external exams. And Kirsty Williams pointed out that that was a matter that should be addressed to the WJEC. And if you're happy that I do that, because the issue, if you remember, was that they don't get the same length of additional time as some other youngsters with special needs. Now, we're not suggesting for 1 minute that Syrian youngsters have special needs in the normal sense, but they have additional language needs. And there might be a need for a translator to go through with them and so on. And so if committee is happy that having raised it with Kirsty Williams and being pointed in another direction, that I now do that and try to get a bit of a longer time, not only for these youngsters, but for children in similar situations elsewhere. The second thing, and this in a sense arises from the special meeting, But nonetheless, I'd like to raise it now because there are some immediate repercussions from it, I think. One of the reasons why we had the special meeting on the 3rd of January was to consider the protocol that would bind the local authority and the governing bodies of its maintained schools. And that was actually withdrawn from further discussion, pending discussion around points of concern raised by the Monmouthshire Association of School Governors, and also by me as chair about the need for a greater consistency of language throughout that report. And committee agreed that I would call together a meeting of representatives of MASG and of the authority. And I just wanted to let you know that despite our best efforts, we've gone through about 20 dates so far, and somebody hasn't been able to get to that meeting. But I think it looks like at the moment we're all agreed that we can make a meeting. And so hopefully we can resolve remaining issues around that protocol. There's a statutory duty to have it in place, and hopefully we can bring that to the next meeting of this committee, or certainly, if not, the one after that. It's not been forgotten, is the basic message. It's simply been, we're all busy people and our diaries have clashed. But I just wanted to bring those two issues to committee. Are there any other issues that anybody wants to raise on the minutes? Okay, so we have got the forward work plan and we have got the cabinet work planner. Both of those, the documents are in there. This is where Ms. Eilert would normally bring us up to date with any last-minute changes, or indeed if there are any additional issues that members of this committee would like to put into that planning framework. Obviously, Ms. Eilert is unable to be with us today. So the second part of that, are there any issues that we would like to add at this point? Mr. McLean, would you like to raise a point?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like the CYP Select Committee to consider my Chief Officer's report prior to it going to Council. I think I'm aiming for an April meeting of Council.
Well, we'd certainly hope we could see that before it goes to Council, so we can put you over the coals before... Can we make sure it comes... so a bit of negotiation with the Chief Officer to make sure it's written before we ask him to come along here. But thank you for that. Councillor John?
On Friday last week, we launched a consultation on admission policies in secondary school catchment areas. I'd be really interested in the feedback of members and whether you choose to do that individually or as a committee. I'd be very interested to hear feedback.
I think in that it's likely to be something of a hot potato in some parts of the county. Perhaps it would be an issue to bring to full committee. So could we add update on the review of school catchment areas? Thank you very much indeed for that. Did I see another hand about Mr. Fowler?
It was just a query looking at the forward planner, actually. It said that we were to have a special mid-January, and that was supposed to have been before this one.
I think that was the one that took place on the 3rd of January.
Oh, no, there's two specials in the first on the forward planner. There was the special that was the 3rd that did this partnership agreements, and then there was supposed to be another mid-January special that was looking at school transport and family support services. I don't know what happened to that meeting.
No, certainly no reports were brought forward for me to consider bringing a meeting. We have another meeting in the not too distant future now, and I don't think there's anything urgent in those issues that you raised there. We heard earlier when Councillor Easton raised an issue on school transport that that's clearly a matter under consideration. In that instance, the specific issue around provision of transport to Welsh education. But I'm not aware of there having been any pressing need for a committee to have discussed that. So hopefully, if there was a meeting that slipped under the radar, then we haven't lost anything. I would be mortified if we have. Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I noticed obviously on the forward work programme it says 24th of January. future options for Mountain House School, and it says will need to move. Presumably that's that's going to come to the February committee, is it? Sorry. And the other question I'd got is about obviously the new curriculum. It would be helpful if we had some information on that. I mean, it does, under schools in terms of outcomes, it does mention, the Donaldson Report on Successful Futures review of schools and so forth, and the curriculum, because obviously there's going to be a proposed massive change, and I think it would be useful to have something on that. I'm not sure whether that's about April this year that it's supposed to be coming out, but I think it's something to that would be useful for this committee to look at.
Certainly, and I know that schools are working hard at the moment. The Pioneer School's working very hard with the schools around the county. But yes, it's clearly going to be a sea change in terms of curriculum in our schools. So that's a point well made. Any immediate thoughts, Mr. McLean?
Thank you, Chair. I think anything on the new curriculum, I think it'd be really useful for the EAS to be involved in presenting that. And it's, without me sounding like I'm abdicating any responsibility, it is, in our partnership with the EAS, that is the work that they lead on. Having spent time yesterday with the cabinet members and directors across Gwent, I think there is a huge amount of activity in that area. And it would be really good, I think, perhaps for James or Helen to come and present to committee about where we are and what the stages are, because I think members' awareness of that would be a really useful thing.
Yeah, certainly that's the way it's been handled thus far, and clearly I think that's the right way to go forward. So could we put that down to, what about around April time, Mr. McLean? Do you think that would... Yeah, so around April time. Councillor Brown? Yep, sorry.
Yes, the question of when the report on Mountain House was coming to the committee wasn't answered. So if I could have an answer to that, please, Chair.
February. I think we've said that this morning. Yeah.
Okay, so Councillor Woodhouse.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the future agreed work programme, I noticed nursery provision. I think the 30 hours is an important matter. I just wondered when it would be a suitable time to schedule that for.
Yeah, that was something that was raised by Councillor Lane, I believe, wasn't it? And so, again, Mr. McLean, where are we with that? Would we have sooner or later to see where that's going?
The question of timing on all of these matters is always a tricky thing, isn't it? We had the discussion around breakfast clubs at our last council meeting, and from our perspective, giving any introduction of a new service time or a change in service time to bed in, so we can kind of really gauge what's happened. I know that members, I'm sure, will have been contacted by constituents and so on around some of the initial administrative processes around the 30 hours offer. Certainly I've been contacted by members about that. The way that offer is administered in Monmouthshire is that we engage with the settings and so on, but the process is administered by Newport. So if members were to wish to kind of scrutinise that process, I'd have to liaise with colleagues in Newport for them to represent or have representation at the meeting so that they could answer the questions directly. We're just not responsible for that process at the moment.
Okay, so we're looking again March, April time to enable that liaison to take place and an officer from that authority to come and talk to us about that provision. Councillor Woodhouse.
Just another point, Chairman. The place efficiency assessment, that was in the minutes from the 29th of November. It's on the forward action plan, action list to come and give us a feedback on it at the February meeting on the actual sufficiency assessment of the children and young people. Where are we? Officers are requested to report the results of the place efficiency assessment at the meeting, this meeting, on the 21st of February. But I note in the forward planner that it does mention a March date, so I wonder if we could clarify that one.
I would hope that we could make it February. If you remember, the officer that led the discussion on that was talking about how that's money that sort of mysteriously drops from the sky at the end of the financial year. And as a committee, you asked me to write to the Welsh Government to say that play actually was more important and deserved a clear grant in its own right to enable the authority and its officers to plan for play activities and so on. And I did that. Unfortunately, in that instance, I did not get a reply from Welsh Government, but rest assured I did write to say that in the view of this committee, planning for play and then delivering good play opportunities to youngsters is a very important part of their socialisation and wider education. And it's disappointing, perhaps, that we didn't get a response on that issue. But yes, I take that point. And also, you remember that I raised a point of that being a statutory duty on a service that is in future going to be arm's length, because that provision will form part of Mon Life. And I think we also need to be assured that provision will be in place to enable officers of the County Council and of Mon Life to be able to liaise to fulfil our statutory duties as an authority that will remain the authority's legal responsibilities even when Mon Life is delivering on a day-to-day basis. So let's look towards February, but it may be that we haven't had the response to that to the funding request from the Welsh Government by then, in which case we'd clearly want to defer to March. Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you. I was looking at page 719, and it mentions there about mental health and learning disabilities, although it's linked to some particular grants. But the reason for raising that is I recall last year I can remember hearing something on the news about how in England they were considering providing extra mental health support in schools for pupils, and I just wondered whether, through the Barnett formula, anything similar was happening in relation to the Welsh Government and the sort of support, because we did hear in council as well, and it has been raised in the social justice strategy group about young people's mental health being a particular issue. And obviously, we do hear about these terrible reports on about how people get involved in social media and end up being suicidal and so forth. So I was just wondering what the situation was in Wales in relation to that particular issue, and whether it would be something that the committee would want to have a look at.
I believe there certainly has been an initiative from Welsh Government around this issue. Mr McLean?
There are several initiatives around mental health and emotional well-being in Wales at the moment. There was a conference last Monday. I think the ministers, Vaughan Gethin and Kirsty Williams, were both present at that, and I think they announced an extra 7.1 million at that event. The work I referenced earlier across Aneurin Bevan and the various local authorities is also looking very carefully at emotional health and emotional well-being and mental health. It would probably be a really good agenda item to bring back to committee, because it is kind of very multifaceted. It involves a whole range of different settings, from schools through to other kind of services in terms of youth service and so on, all the way through to very, very specialist support services. And it's also quite a complex change area at the moment. So, I'd be more than happy to bring something on that back to committee.
Would committee be happy that perhaps if I liaise with Mr McLean and we can look at how we can bring in different parts of the local authority who will be able to make a solid contribution around mental health of young people and bring that at the first opportunity to committee. So thank you for raising that. I think it is a very important issue. Mr Fowler.
Just a kind of seeking clarity, really. I know school categorisation is imminent. I was just wondering, as we now don't have the rich data that we're used to, the categorisation forms a more important barometer as to our school's progress. I was just wondering when we expect to see a report on the state of our schools from that point of view.
Mr. McLean, any suggestions?
It's on the list of your things you want to look at in terms of the forward work programme, certainly. I'd be happy to work with Wendy or whoever to find an appropriate date for that. National verification took place last week, so I would expect publication of the outcomes of that to be end of January. It will be updated onto my local school at that point. So yeah, more than happy to bring that back to February if that's convenient.
Yeah, my understanding is that the categorisations are published formally on the 31st of January. Yeah, I think that would be an interesting thing for us to look at. The only remaining thing then, item 11, is to confirm the time of the next meeting, 21st of February, 10 o'clock. And could I thank you all for your attendance this morning. I am glad that we receive our agendas electronically, because I note that had we received them by paper, there would have been 754 pages. So thank you, members of this committee, for your pertinent questioning this morning, and for the obvious ability you have to read such lengthy agendas. So with those thanks, I'll close the meeting.